Welcome to the deep dive. So, um, I want you to imagine a scenario. If global borders just closed completely tomorrow, no cargo ships, no international flights, no cross-border trucking at all.
Right, total lockdown.
Yeah, exactly. Which global superpower do you think would starve first? Because you might immediately picture, I don't know, a tiny, isolated island nation. But the answer might actually be a massive, wealthy military powerhouse.
Oh, absolutely. It forces a total reevaluation of how we measure resilience, honestly. We usually think of national strength in terms of, GDP or tech hubs or massive defense budgets.
Right.
But when you really look closely at the architecture of global trade, especially after those wild supply chain shocks we've all experienced at the grocery store over the last few years, you realize that hard currency means, well, very little if you literally can't feed your own population.
Which is exactly why today's mission is so fascinating. We are setting out to discover and specifically compare which countries have the greatest overall food self-sufficiency on the global stage.
Yeah, we're unpacking this incredible data set based on a 2025 study from Nature, visualized by Visual Capitalist. They ranked 50 countries on their overall ability to feed themselves. And the names sitting at the top of this list, they are going to completely upend what you think you know about national power.
They really are. But before we get into comparing these top-ranked countries, we really have to clarify what feeding themselves actually means in the context of this study.
That's a crucial point.
Because I initially assumed this was just a measure of raw agricultural volume, like whoever grows the most millions of tons of corn or wheat just automatically takes the gold medal.
Right, but if it were just a matter of sheer caloric tonnage, the map would look very, very different. The crucial mechanism at the heart of this data is that it measures the percentage of domestic demand met by local production, specifically according to, quote, food-based dietary guidelines.
Okay, let's unpack that, because that phrase, food-based dietary guidelines, is the absolute foundation of everything we're about to talk about. The researchers didn't just look at total calories, right?
Exactly. They broke human dietary needs down into 7 specific pillars to represent a complete, balanced plate.
So for you listening, think about those essential building blocks of a meal. We're talking fruit, veggies, legumes, starchy staples, meat, fish, and dairy. Those 7 categories.
And the logic driving that methodology is nutritional sovereignty. Because, you can't just keep a population alive on a single type of fuel long term. If you want a healthy, functioning society, you need all of those nutritional gears turning together.
Makes total sense.
So the study explicitly rewards countries that are self-sufficient across a broader spectrum of those 7 food groups. It is deeply, deeply focused on the absence of deficits.
Which poses the central question I really want you to keep in mind as we look at who actually won out here. What makes a country truly resilient? Is it about producing a massive, overwhelming surplus of just 1 or 2 key crops to trade on the global market?
Or is it about having a perfectly balanced, completely enclosed system?
Right. Because this data really acts as a masterclass in the tension between being a global agricultural giant and being completely self-reliant.
It highlights a huge vulnerability in modern agriculture, honestly. So many nations have optimized their farming sectors to generate cash through global trade. They've built a business model.
Yeah, a business model.
But a business model is very different from a survival model designed to keep a nation fed regardless of geopolitical instability.
I think that perfectly sets the stage for the country sitting at the absolute top of the list, the undisputed champion. When I first pulled up this chart, my eyes were scanning for the U.S. or France or, massive land-rich countries like Brazil.
Naturally.
But the nation that takes the #1 spot, the country that best feeds itself across the board, is Guyana.
The statistical profile for Guyana is genuinely staggering. When you look at the raw percentages of what they produce relative to what their population actually needs, it almost looks like an error in the data.
It really does. It's so universally strong. Let's actually walk through how they hit those 7 pillars, because the margin of their success is wild.
Go for it.
So for fruit, Guyana produces 403% of its domestic demand.
400%.
Yeah. And for veggies, they are at 223%. Legumes, 128%. Starchy staples, which is usually a massive hurdle for a lot of places, is sitting at an enormous 561%.
Oh, wow.
Meat is at 319%. Fish is 194%. And finally, dairy is at 111%.
Notice the common thread there, right? Every single one of those numbers is over 100%.
Yeah, I look at Guyana like an Olympic decathlete who somehow takes home the gold medal in every single event. We aren't talking about a country that just squeaks by with the bare minimum.
Exactly. They produce more than their entire population needs across every single nutritional category. And that answers why they secure the definitive #1 spot based on the study's overall metric.
Because they have no blind spots.
Precisely. The researchers specifically looked for the gap between national food production and those food-based dietary guidelines. Guyana has absolutely zero gaps. Every other country on this 50-nation list has an Achilles heel.
Some weak point in their agricultural ecosystem that forces them to rely on imports. So, okay, the obvious question is, how are they pulling this off? How does a relatively small South American nation manage to over-deliver on literally everything, from root vegetables to dairy?
Well, it comes down to a highly favorable ratio of population size to arable land, and that's combined with a very diverse tropical and coastal geography.
Okay, so they have the physical space and the right weather.
Right. They have the climate to support heavy, water-intensive, starchy staples and tropical fruits. They have ample coastline for a robust fishing industry, and they have enough pasture land to sustain meat and dairy for their relatively small population. They aren't locked into a monoculture.
So if a giant dome were to just drop over Guyana tomorrow, cutting off all global trade, their daily lives barely change from a nutritional standpoint. You still have your fruit, your beans, your bread, your meat, and your milk.
That is the ultimate mechanism of resilience. They haven't just hyper-optimized a single cash crop. They've maintained a fully enclosed nutritional ecosystem.
Okay, so if Guyana represents the perfect generalist, it makes me incredibly curious about comparing them to the runners-up. If the goal is just covering your bases, what is keeping the massive traditional agricultural heavyweights from taking that crown?
Yeah, let's look at the next tier.
That brings us to rank number 2 and rank number 3 overall, Vietnam and China.
These are the countries you intuitively expect to dominate a list like this. I mean, they have massive land masses, diverse climates, deep agricultural histories, and they are feeding enormous populations.
And when you look at their raw output, the scale is almost difficult to comprehend. Let's look at China at number 3. China is producing 336% of its domestic vegetable needs.
For over 1 billion people.
Exactly. And 301% of its meat? We are talking about feeding over 1 billion people, and they are producing triple what they need in those categories. And then Vietnam, at number 2, produces 312% of its starchy staples, and over 230% for both meat and fish.
The volume is just astounding.
But let me push back on the ranking logic for a second here. If China and Vietnam are churning out 3 times what they need in these heavy lifting categories like staples and meat, why are they stuck behind Guyana?
It's a fair question.
Surely producing 300% of the vegetables for 1 billion people is a heavier lift and arguably a greater display of agricultural might than what Guyana is doing.
It is a phenomenal display of volume for sure. But remember that the mechanism of this ranking system penalizes deficits above all else.
Right.
It honestly doesn't matter how high your surplus is in one area if you leave your population vulnerable in another. And there is one specific column that drags both Vietnam and China down from that top spot.
Let me guess.
It's their dairy production. Yeah, I see it on the far right of the data set. Vietnam only produces 14% of its domestic dairy demand, and China is only producing 29%.
This is a perfect example of how specific dietary guidelines dictate the overall ranking. If the nutritional standard requires a certain amount of dairy for calcium and other vital nutrients, and you only produce 14% of it locally.
You have a massive gap.
Exactly. You are inherently reliant on other nations to complete your population's nutritional profile.
It's kind of like building an impenetrable fortress. You have 50-foot concrete walls, state-of-the-art security, laser grids, but you just left the back door completely wide open. The chain of self-sufficiency is only as strong as its weakest link.
That's a fantastic way to visualize it. The algorithm severely penalizes that 14% and 29% because, in the event of a global supply chain disruption, sheer volume in rice or pork cannot biologically mask a severe deficit in another required nutrient.
Right, you can't just substitute extra pork for missing calcium long-term.
Exactly. Biology doesn't work that way. Okay, so Vietnam and China make total sense as near-perfect runners-up. They are absolute powerhouses with one specific, geographically or historically driven blind spot. But this brings me to a country on the list that I find completely baffling.
Oh, I know where you're going.
Sitting right behind China, at number 4 in the world overall, is Oman.
The Oman paradox. It's such a fascinating case study in strategic compensation.
Paradox is an understatement, honestly. When I look at Oman's scorecard, there are actual shocking zeros.
Literal zero.
Oman produces 0% of its legumes. Zero. And a mere 1% of its starchy staples. I genuinely don't understand the math here. How on earth does a country that produces virtually zero staples, no wheat, no rice, no potatoes, and zero beans, somehow beat out 46 other countries to take the #4 spot in the entire world?
To solve that puzzle, you really have to look at the underlying logic of the ranking system and how it weights broad sufficiency against specific extreme deficits.
Okay.
It's true, Oman completely misses 2 entire food groups, but look at how heavily they over-deliver on the remaining 5.
Okay, let me read these off. Fish is at 373%. Veggies are 159%. Fruit is 112%. Meat is 107%. And dairy is 129%.
The key is the distribution. Oman is fully self-sufficient, meaning they produce over 100% of their needs in 5 out of the 7 categories. The ranking system rewards them for locking down the vast majority of their dietary pillars, even if they have to completely import the rest.
My initial thought was to compare this to taking a test where you leave 2 questions completely blank, but you get an A+ on everything else. But that metaphor doesn't really work for human survival, does it?
Not quite, no.
Because you can't just skip carbohydrates and plant proteins entirely and expect to maintain a healthy population just because you have extra fish.
Right, biology doesn't allow you to skip requirements. A much better analogy is building a car.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine a manufacturing plant that doesn't produce its own tires or steering wheels. Those are the legumes and staples. But they wildly overproduce the engines, the chassis, the electronics, the seats, and the glass.
So they have highly valuable, highly liquid assets in a global crisis. They can easily take their surplus of high-value items, like the fish and dairy, and trade them on the open market for the bulk staples they lack.
Exactly. They hold incredible leverage. And when you look at the geography, it's a brilliant strategic adaptation. I mean, Oman is a desert nation on the coast. Growing water-intensive, starchy staples or vast fields of legumes is just geographically and economically unfeasible.
They accept their geographic determinism.
Precisely. They leaned into their coastline for massive fish yields, and they've clearly made huge targeted infrastructure investments like greenhouses and specialized farming to ensure their meat, dairy, and vegetable needs were met locally.
They essentially engineered their way into the top 5 overall by playing a highly strategic game of agricultural leverage. They're missing pieces, sure, but they hold enough high-value cards to trade for whatever they need.
And if you contrast that with lower-ranked nations that might not have any zeros on their scorecard, but they are broadly deficient, maybe producing only 60 or 70% of their needs across 3 or 4 different categories.
Right.
Ullman's strategy of absolute sufficiency in 5 categories is mathematically and practically stronger than being slightly deficient in almost everything.
That makes a lot of sense when you put it like that. But seeing how Ullman's calculated balance secured a top spot makes me want to flip the script entirely.
Let's do it.
What happens to countries that put all their agricultural chips on one single square? The nations that produce mind-boggling, almost industrial amounts of just 1 or 2 items.
The hyper-specialists. This is where the data reveals a completely different philosophy regarding national agriculture. And it really highlights the tension between economic power and true fundamental resilience.
I want to point you way down the list to New Zealand, sitting at rank number 27.
Way down there.
Yeah. When most people picture New Zealand, they think of endless green pastures, sheep, massive agricultural exports. You would assume they'd easily be in the top 10 for overall self-sufficiency, but they are dead in the middle of the pack.
And their numbers are incredibly lopsided. Let's look at their surpluses because they are truly jaw-dropping. For meat, New Zealand is producing 1,549% of their domestic demand.
Over 15 times what their population actually eats.
And dairy is even more extreme. This is actually the highest single number on the entire chart across all 50 countries.
Wait for it.
New Zealand produces 6,100% of its domestic dairy demand.
6,100%. My analogy for this is it's like having $1 billion, but the strict condition is you are only allowed to spend it on milk and steak.
Right.
You are undeniably wealthy, you have massive resources, but your diet is an absolute disaster. You can't just drink milk for every meal of the day.
And that extreme imbalance is precisely why New Zealand sits at 27th overall, despite leading the entire world in dairy surplus. Look at their other pillars. They only produce 32% of their legumes and only 61% of their starchy staples.
So they are heavily dependent on imports just for basic carbohydrates and plant proteins.
Right. And going back to the core methodology we talked about, the focus is on food-based dietary guidance. You cannot feed a population entirely on export levels of beef and cheese.
Yeah, if the cargo ships stop arriving with wheat and lentils, New Zealand's 6,000% dairy surplus isn't going to prevent long-term nutritional deficiencies.
Exactly. It's an economic machine. It's a business model, not a survival model. They are prioritizing global cash over local calories.
It is a highly optimized export-driven monoculture. Right. And they aren't alone in this strategy, are they?
No, not at all. There are several regional hyperspecialists that follow this exact pattern. Look at the South American nations on the list. You see almost industrial-scale legume production. Paraguay produces 7,545% of its legumes.
That's insane.
Uruguay is at 3,817%. Brazil sits at 2,296%.
Let me guess, that's almost entirely soy.
Yeah.
Right? They're growing legumes to feed the world's livestock, not necessarily to feed their own people.
Exactly. It's an export powerhouse metric driven by the global meat market. But look at their overall rankings. Paraguay is ranked 21st overall, and Uruguay is 26th.
Why?
Because that intense focus on cash crop legumes distorts their entire agricultural profile. Paraguay only hits 35% of its required veggies and 19% for fish. Uruguay only manages 41% for veggies and 68% for fish.
It is genuinely wild to think about. A country like Paraguay is literally covered in farms, producing 75 times the legumes they need. But they still have to import basic vegetables just to give their own citizens a healthy meal.
It is wild. And we see the exact same vulnerability in Northern Europe. Look at Baltic states like Latvia sitting at number 10 and Estonia at number 15. They have immense surpluses in staples, and dairy Estonia is at 995% for dairy and 459% for staples. But their climates and agricultural policies result in severe deficits elsewhere.
What are they missing?
They sit at under 25% for both fruit and veggies. Latvia is at 14% for fruit and 23% for veggies. Estonia is producing a mere 3% of its fruit and 15% of its veggies.
Wow. So they have absolute mountains of bread and milk, but practically zero apples or carrots.
Precisely. And to be fair, from an economic standpoint, in a world of open trade, this hyper-specialization is brilliant. New Zealand's dairy and Paraguay's soy bring in massive foreign capital.
Sure.
But from the strict perspective of this study, nutritional sovereignty and resilience in the face of supply chain collapse, these models leave severe vulnerabilities.
Okay, let's pull all of these threads together, because the comparison is so striking. We've looked at the perfect generalist in Guyana. We've seen the dairy-deficient giants in Vietnam and China. We decoded the calculated trade-offs of Oman, and we just examined the economic hyper-specialists like New Zealand and Paraguay.
The contrast is amazing.
The through line here is undeniable. True global food resilience, overall self-sufficiency, isn't about the sheer tonnage of cash crops a country can export. It's about the geographical and agricultural diversity to meet a well-rounded dietary standard locally.
It requires a holistic, enclosed system.
Which brings us right back to why Guyana, a country that rarely comes up in conversations about global superpowers, sits firmly on the throne of this dataset. They've managed to cover every single nutritional base without leaving a single gap for the outside world to exploit.
They really have. And I think that leaves us with a really vital, perhaps provocative concept to explore on our own. Yeah, we need to be careful not to say that agricultural isolation is the only kind of power. Open trade creates immense wealth. But when we look at this list, major Western powers are either scattered lower down, like Australia at number 25, or entirely absent.
Yeah, I noticed that.
The United States doesn't even make the cut for this top 50 excerpt.
That continues to blow my mind, honestly. The U.S. isn't even there.
It really forces a perspective shift. But let's take it one step further. As climate change begins to rapidly shift where these 7 pillars can even be grown, as arable land moves, as coastlines change, as water becomes scarce, the ability to maintain that perfect enclosed nutritional loop is going to become increasingly rare.
So the map of who holds the cards could redraw itself completely over the next few decades.
Exactly. It begs the question. In a future of changing climates and fragile supply chains, will the ultimate definition of a global superpower shift away from who holds the most advanced military tech to simply who has the geographic luck and policy foresight to put a fully balanced meal on the table without asking anyone else for help?
The completely self-sustaining bunker hidden in plain sight. That is a radically different kind of power. Thanks for diving deep with us today.